Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to welcome the Ambassador of Germany to Georgia, Mr. Hubert to Ilia State University. As you all know, Ilia State University has had very important and very close links with German institutions, and I think that we are just mirroring a very fruitful history of cooperation of Georgia with Germany. As you know, Germany has played a crucial role in our first independence in 1918, which was basically declared through the support of the German state. But before and after that, Germany has been in German language, German culture, German science has been extremely important to the development of Georgian institutions, of Georgian culture, Georgian science, Georgian scholarship, and this can be seen in very different areas. Actually, the intellectual elite of the Georgian science studied in the beginning of the 20th century in Germany, came back, founded a university. Those people who have studied mostly in Germany become founders of the scientific disciplines in Georgia, history, philosophy, economics, etc. So these ties have existed throughout the 20th century, even during the Soviet times, and they have intensified since very strongly. And at Ilia State University we have now projects of cooperation of extreme importance for the development of doctoral education with the University of Göttingen and Münster, and for the development of forest science with the help of GTZ and DAD, for the study of biodiversity of Caucasus, for which a special center will be founded very soon. An extremely important and fruitful project will be developed. So this is also of great importance that we have now the ambassador who will remind us of a very important event of recent history, an event which has played a crucial role in the development of our region as well. It's the 1989, and I think that this is almost like the first event which will start a series of commemorations, I'm sure, of very important days for the history of Georgia and for the history of Eastern Europe, for the history of Europe as such. And I'm very pleased to give the floor to you now, Mr. Knirschi.
When you invited me to come here, I was thinking this is the ideal opportunity to start off our series of events on 1989 plus 30. As you will see from my lecture, this year 1989 was important historically. I will also not hide that it was important for me personally, and make that part of it. So it gives me all the more reason to talk about it. Here in Georgia, I have often heard references to the German situation in various contexts, political contexts. For instance, just recently, a retired general of the United States Army ventured the idea Georgia could become a member of NATO quickly because Germany was a member of NATO, even being a divided country. I didn't understand the argument right away, but I tried to understand it anyway. He made a reference, a comparison between Georgia today and Germany back then, which is not at all obvious. You have torn away regions. We had the division of Germany. I think we will see that there are significant differences between these two situations. Also, of course, we have the idea that applied to Georgia. How should Georgia deal with its torn away regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia? Wouldn't something like a Ostpolitik, policy of detente make sense, as West Germany pursued it in the 1970s? And well, let's talk about it. Let's see what the terms and conditions of such a policy are. All of you are young people here in the audience, so maybe not all of you even remember the Berlin Wall. Some of you do, I hope. Let me remind you what the situation was when I was a teenager, for instance. I come from West Germany, and every school class in West Germany was expected to do a trip to Berlin to find out about the particular situation of Berlin and to see the Berlin Wall. And I remember this moment. We went to one particular street in Berlin where you saw the walls of houses, shop windows, but behind the wall there was no house. There was an empty space, and 3 meters behind the wall there was the Berlin Wall. Empty shop windows that said something, and the border was right behind there. And it was really depressing. We were standing there, school students, teenagers, we were cool, we enjoyed the discotheques of Berlin and all that. And then this side, somebody builds a wall in a city, you can never cross here, and the others cannot cross. So they stood there and turned to each other, and somebody said, well, Hubert, what do you think? Will this wall ever go away? And I had my chance to become famous. I said, I think it will go away. And then all of a sudden, all my friends turned to me, what's wrong with you? What do you think? Are you crazy? Are you naive? This is going here to stay. The wall is as old as we are, and there's no sign of it going away. So I became shy, and I missed my chance to enter history as a prophet. I said, yes, okay, I think it will go away, but of course not during our lifetime. It will stand there for our children to see. And that was 1976, so the wall had 13, 14 more years to go. We didn't know that. Allow me to lay out a bit of the history of German division and unification. And please bear with me if this is somewhat complicated at certain stages. The legal points are not unimportant here if you want to understand how it came to the situation of division and how 40 years after the division, the unification of Germany occurred. Of course, you know that the division of Germany was a result of World War II, a devastating war for all of Europe that Germany had started. Let me see if I can also start my presentation here. Yes? Okay. You see a map of Germany at the end of World War II and what the occupying powers did with it. The victorious powers, the 4 Allied powers, were the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France. When Germany capitulated on May 8th, 1945, it was not at all clear that the powers wanted to divide Germany into two. During the war, at various conferences, they had discussed various options of what to do with Germany. But they could never find agreement between themselves. Interesting lesson. They were able to fight a war together, having won huge armies, but they were not able to agree politically on what to do with Germany afterwards. So they decided to let it stand and let's decide about that later on. At the Yalta conference, the Allied powers decided to do the following. You see the area to the right with its stripes. This was part of Germany in 1937. And it was decided to cut these parts, to divide these parts off. The dividing line is the river Oder and the small river the Neiße. And to put these territories under Polish administration. Polish administration, that doesn't mean that Poland gets to have the territories. They were not annexed to Poland. But for the time being, the agreement was to have decisions later on, maybe in a peace treaty with Germany. For the time being, they are under Polish administration. And a small area in the upper right-hand corner, can you identify what that area is? Does everybody know it? Königsberg, the Kaliningrad Oblast, Königsberg, that's right. So this one came under Soviet occupation, was made part of the Russian Socialist Republic, and is now part of the Russian Federation to this day. All the rest was divided into occupation zones. France got an occupation zone to the southwest. That, by the way, is the area where my parents grew up, so when I hear about their stories of their youth, they lived under French occupation. The Americans occupied Bavaria and Hessen. The British had an occupation zone in the northwest. And the Soviet occupation zone was what you see here in the center, basically. Some people call it Mitteldeutschland. And right in the middle of it, you have the city of Berlin, where you see the small flags arranged in a circle. Occupation didn't mean dismemberment. The idea was not to cut Germany apart. All the four powers agreed that they wanted to govern Germany, to rule Germany together. And for instance, the Soviet side, Stalin, was very interested not to divide Germany at this point, because he wanted to get reparation payments and goods for reparation from the Western occupation zones. So had they divided Germany, we would have had only the Eastern zone, and there was not so much to get there. The idea was to get more in the West. Over time, throughout the late 1940s, the Cold War started. So relations between the four Allied powers got worse and worse. And the idea to make joint decisions later on became more and more distant, more and more difficult. There were ministerial conferences, but they made no progress towards a post-war settlement. In this situation, all of the four occupying powers re-established regional German governments in their occupation zones. Germany is traditionally a federal country. The regions are very important, capitals and governments, and the Allied powers reorganized them. For instance, here in the southwest, you had a land called Baden, another one, Württemberg. Bavaria was set up again as a state and so on. And in the Soviet occupation zone, also Länder were created, like Brandenburg, Mecklenburg, and so on. This was the beginning of a new political life in Germany. Political parties were legalized, people could go and join the party. And the party system that we have today was created in this situation. It is rather surprisingly, this was around 1946, 1947, so the war was not so long over. All of Germany had been ruled by the National Socialist Party, which was a formidable power. But the Allies were actually, I would say, courageous enough to let the Germans create political parties. Of course, under Allied control, there was some degree of oversight. Already in 1947, the US Secretary of State, Arthur Burns, gave a famous speech in Stuttgart. And he argued that in front of the German public that the United States should pursue the following policy. They should make the western part, the non-Soviet occupied part of Germany, economically strong. Well, to create a good living standard and to make this region strong, and it would act as a magnet and pull the eastern part over to the west. This was a very far-reaching idea in 1947 in a country destroyed by war where reconstruction had just barely begun. But the Soviets were toppling governments, for instance, in Czechoslovakia. They were installing communist governments in all of Eastern Europe, and the West needed some idea of how to consolidate itself, and of how not to lose all of Germany, which would have been a bad development. At a conference in London in early 1948, the Western Allies, so now we have not the 4 allies, but only the 3, the United States, Great Britain and France, decided to create a West German state. That is to put the Länder governments, the regional governments under one roof and to have a new federal state. The Soviet Union was against this, and they reacted by withdrawing their representative from the Allied Control Council. This may have been a very bad decision of the Soviet Union, because in this way the Allied governments, 4 Allied powers together, ceased to exist. It never worked again. They withdrew once and they were out, and it never operated again. So there was no opportunity anymore to make joint decisions about Germany. And each occupying power continued to do what it wanted to do in its zone. In protest against the idea of forming a West German state, the Soviet authorities cut all the land connections between the western zones and Berlin. And I didn't mention them, but perhaps you know, I didn't mention that the city of Berlin itself was also divided. Where you had 4 occupying zones, occupation zones in Germany, you had 4 sectors in Berlin. Soviet sector, French sector, British and American. And to get from, let's say, an American base in Bavaria to the American sector of Berlin to send supplies or reinforcements or to get people out, you had to travel through the Soviet zone. That was no problem in 1945, when there were allies, in 1946, but when the Cold War started, this became a problem. And in 1948, the Soviet authorities cut off these communications. The effect was that the western half of Berlin became an island. It had no connection to the west. It was difficult to have a connection to the east. Stalin probably believed that the Western Allies would give in a short time and stop their ideas of creating a West German state. The famous decision of the United States was to supply West Berlin through an airlift, the Berlin Airlift. And it was an operation completely unthinkable in those days, but they started it, and with a huge number of aircraft, West Berlin was supplied. A city of more than 2 million inhabitants was supplied out of the air for many months. At the same time, a parliamentary council convened and started work on a West German constitution. The Grundgesetz, the fundamental law of the new Federal Republic of Germany, came into effect on May 23rd, 1949. Within half a year it was elaborated, it was worked out, it was agreed by the Länder parliaments, and it became the effective constitution. For a long time, East German government said that it was the West that wanted the division of Germany, because it was the West that first created the Federal Republic, and the German Democratic Republic in the East was created a little after that. So let's see what the Constitution had to say in this situation. It was a dilemma for the politicians of West Germany. They wanted to have a German state, they wanted democracy and sovereignty and run their affairs. But how to deal with the problem that you represented only part of the nation? So the Constitution, and I abbreviate it a little bit, starts by saying, the German people, wait a minute, this is not possible, we are not the German people, we are only the German people in the Western occupation zones. So the German people in the Länder of Baden, Bayern, Bremen, Hamburg, Hessen, Niedersachsen, and so on, they enumerated all the regions. so as to give a new order to its statehood for an interim period. And this was the constitution that we had when I was born, and then I went to school, and then I left school, and then I left university. Interim period. In exercise of its power to give itself a constitution, has decided upon this fundamental law of the Federal Republic of Germany. In doing so, it has acted also on behalf of those Germans to whom it was not granted to take part. This was the construction and the idea in which the constitution was passed. And the next sentence reads, the entire German people continues to be called upon to complete the unity and freedom of Germany by free self-determination. When I first read this in the 1970s, it was a complete utopia. Complete utopia. What was the idea? How could one pass from the West German state to a unified German state? The constitution had to make provisions for that. And it opened two alternative ways. In Article 23, it said that Länder, which are not part of the Federal Republic of Germany, can join later at their own decision. And in another article, 146, it was stipulated that Germany could create a new constitution, that the German people could agree on a new constitution in free self-determination. Two possible paths to unification, but they were completely theoretical. Nobody could tell how a situation could come in which this would become practical. The Federal Republic of Germany, supported by the Western Allied powers, saw itself as the only legitimate German state. In West Germany, we had democracy, we had elections. We said, okay, sovereignty has passed to us, we are exercising it. Whereas in the East, the Soviets are saying that they have also passed power to the German Democratic Republic. We know that this is not a democratic country, there are no free elections, and that the Soviet Union makes sure that the government will always follow their orders, if they give any. So in reality, this is not a legitimate state, this is not Germany. This is an occupation regime. So here in Georgia, again, I hear that it is important to call already regions occupied regions. Well, in Germany, there were those in West Germany who were very strict about things, and they said, no, you don't call it the GDR, you call it the Soviet occupation zone. And there were some German newspapers which applied such terminology for decades. Also, from its own beginning, the Federal Republic of Germany regarded it as an unfriendly act by other countries if they would enter into diplomatic relations with Eastern Germany, with the German Democratic Republic. Yugoslavia did so, for instance, and the German ambassador was withdrawn from Yugoslavia. And Africa became important for West Germany because there were many countries, many states, and the German ambassador in, who knows, Benin or Botswana or Malawi, all the small African places, had one task. It was not to do anything in Africa, but he was to prevent that this country would recognize the GDR and open diplomatic relations. So we started working in development aid and developed very friendly relations with all African countries in a great effort to keep them from opening diplomatic relations with the GDR.
Sounds like George.
Some things sound familiar to me, yes, and I enjoy that. There were even attempts by the eastern side, the Eastern Bloc, to challenge this policy in Germany. For instance, in 1952, there was a Soviet proposal, so-called Stalin Note, to the Western powers, which actually proposed the reunification of Germany. Oh, fantastic idea, let's get away with this dividing this country, that's not nice, let's have reunification. The condition, of course, was that this country should not be free to choose its alliances. The unified Germany should become neutral. In other words, not a sovereign country, not a country unlike the others. It was very difficult to say no to this offer because Germans in the West very much wanted reunification. And they had not seen their relatives in the East for a long time and so on. But the decision was not to reject this offer outright, but to, of course, to formulate conditions. So, okay, we will talk about this reunification, but the first step have to be free elections. We cannot talk to the government of the GDR if it is not based on free elections. Diplomatic notes went back and forth for a couple of weeks, and then the affair ended. It was clear that it would not come to this solution. In 1958, the Soviet Union tried a different approach, and that was already Mr. Khrushchev. He formulated an ultimatum concerning Berlin, the beginning of the Berlin crisis in 1958. He demanded that the Western powers give up their rights in Berlin. They had their sectors. Khrushchev said, okay, you have to give up your rights there. We reunify, not Germany, but we reunify Berlin as a city. And, oh no, excuse me, that was a mistake. West Berlin, we put West Berlin together and we make West Berlin an independent state. So we have three German states: East Germany, West Germany, and West Berlin. That was his idea. US President Kennedy, the crisis dragged on for a long time, formulated his position in the so-called three essentials. And now it becomes very tricky. His three essentials were Western presence in Berlin, we can remain in the Western sectors. Western access to Berlin is essential, is indispensable. And the safeguarding of the rights and the security of the people of West Berlin by the Western powers. This sounds very good, like a very strong position. He answered Khrushchev's ultimatum. But he forgot one thing. Western presence in Berlin, Western access to Berlin, safeguarding of the rights of the people of West Berlin, and the people of East Berlin were forgotten in his list. And the reaction from the East was the following. Okay, Kennedy is not interested in the East, so let's build a wall. What does he say now? Over time, more and more people had left East Germany and East Berlin to go to the West. After a while, there were controls on the border between the occupation zones. It became more difficult to cross. Barbed wire started to emerge. But Berlin was still a possibility to cross from the east to the west. You could just walk across the street or take a tramway, go to another part of the city. You were in the west, and from there you could also go to the Federal Republic of Germany in the west. This ended on 13th of August 1961. So the wall was already there when I was born. It was already 4 weeks old. It looks very peaceful on this picture, but imagine this square in your city, in your town somewhere, and people appear and make a demarcation and start building a wall, and you will realize you will never be able to cross that street again. From the air, at the center, looked like this, the Brandenburg Gates. And here you get an idea, a first idea, that this was not only a wall. The wall was only this outward thing here, a concrete wall. Behind it you have an open strip with a sort of lane for cars. So in this area, soldiers could pass, dogs could pass. In some parts of Berlin, there were further zones where you had landmines. So people stepping in this area might step on a landmine, and it goes further back until another wall closes off the whole affair to the east. Then you also see this is central Berlin. Maybe have some of you been to Berlin, to the Brandenburg Gate? Today this is a built-up area in this empty space right behind the Brandenburg Gate. Today you have the US Embassy, you have the Holocaust Memorial, many other things. Of course it was built up before World War II also. But at the time of the division of Berlin, this area was left intentionally empty. Soldiers and watchmen should have a free view from their watchtower and should be able to see every movement. And of course it would have been a difficulty for houses standing too close to the border. And this was why the houses that we saw as school students in Berlin were torn down and only their front walls were left standing. The construction of the wall was a shock to Berlin, of course, and to tell the truth, it also created a sort of unease between the Germans, especially the Berliners, and the Americans, which had so supported Berlin, West Berlin, at the time of the airlift. The governing mayor of Berlin, of West Berlin, at this time was Willy Brandt. And he started thinking, what can we do? What can we Germans do? All this is happening to us without, and we have no influence upon events. How can we develop a policy that gives us some control of the situation? In 1969, a new government was formed in the Federal Republic of Germany, and Willy Brandt became the chancellor. Based on earlier considerations, earlier negotiations that had already taken place, Brandt offered direct negotiations with the government of East Germany on an equal basis, but not without conditions and not without a certain understanding of what these negotiations should lead to. I quote, "Recognizing the GDR under international law is out of the question." So recognizing the GDR as a foreign state, like France, like the Soviet Union, that's out of the question. Even though two states exist within Germany, they are not foreign countries to each other. Their relations cannot but be of a special nature. And a lot lies in this special nature. How do you define the nature of this relationship? Brandt offered binding agreements, there's basis here. Binding agreements on the non-use of force with Eastern European countries, including the GDR. And this was not an easy thing to do. The Christian democratic opposition denounced Brandt's ideas as a step away from the earlier policy of unmitigated non-recognition. And I know that non-recognition is a problem in Georgia, but we have to see the differences between the two situations. The Soviet Union was distrustful at first towards Brandt's policies, but it did have an interest in a certain detente at this time. And it wanted as much recognition for existing borders in Europe as it could possibly get. The background was the eastern part of Germany that was still under Polish administration. Practically it had become part of Poland, and the German population had been expelled from this area, millions of people. But legally, it was still not part of Poland internationally. It was to be considered as under Polish administration. And the same applied for the Königsberg area, which was part of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union wanted some sort of recognition from the West that these borders should be final. And the West did not want to give this recognition, of course. So what was possible? Brandt had an important helper in Egon Bahr, maybe you've heard the name, a person who was not trained as a diplomat, but as a journalist. But I would say he was a natural talent. He successfully conducted so-called sounding talks in Moscow to find out what the possibilities were that led to official negotiations and to the conclusion eventually of the Moscow Treaty in 1970. This, do you see the cursor? This is Egon Bahr, who negotiated the whole affair. You see Mr. Brezhnev, who already looks close to death on this picture, but actually this was one of his better moments. And Willy Brandt and Kosygin signing the Moscow Treaty. The Federal Republic and Germany in this treaty and the Soviet Union declared that they regarded all existing borders in Europe. They didn't talk about legal, but about existing state borders in Europe as inviolable. Inviolable means you cannot violate the law. You cannot send troops in or touch anything there. It does not mean that the border cannot be changed. They didn't say unalterable. And there was a lot of negotiation about every word in these treaties. Very importantly, the federal government, the West German government, sent an accompanying letter to the Soviet Union declaring that the conclusion of this treaty, which talked about the existing borders, so also the border inside Germany, was no contradiction to the political intention to work towards a condition of peace in Europe in which the German people will regain its unity in self-determination. Again, complete utopia, and the opposition denounced the Brandt government for entering such conditions. How do you want to work for a solution of a situation of peace in Europe in which such things become possible? And the criticism put down here one newspaper headline of this type. Also, the Western allies were not very confident that these negotiations would lead to anything good. The Moscow Treaty, which had seemed to contain serious one-sided concessions, proved to be key for the following negotiations with the German Democratic Republic, with Poland, and with Czechoslovakia, and also for ongoing parallel negotiations that the four Allied powers held. Now the four came together again, negotiations on Berlin. The four-power agreement on Berlin of 1971 was a very subtle construction, one of the most flimsiest pieces of diplomacy you have ever seen. A little bit like the aircraft that is hanging there from the ceiling. The Soviet Union recognized the four-power status of Berlin. So the mistake of Kennedy, who had referred only to the western sectors, was somehow repaired. They agreed, yes, all of Berlin has a four-power status. The Soviet Union undertook to facilitate land transit communications between Berlin and the Federal Republic through the territory of the GDR. It was recognized that the Federal Republic would represent West Berlin internationally, including vis-à-vis the Soviet Union itself. When I was trained as a young diplomat, when I was first posted to Poland, this was very important. When the governing mayor of West Berlin visited Poland, and we called him the governing mayor of Berlin, we had to make sure that his seat in the conference would be alphabetically in the right place, under B as Berlin, and not W like West Berlin. You say, it's us who are representing West Berlin. Look into the four-power agreement. The Polish government has to talk to the German embassy and not to the mayor of Berlin, who may not know the situation so well. That was a very practical thing. Finally, the GDR was ready to negotiate a broad treaty of its own with the Federal Republic, without insisting on the condition that it should be recognized under international law. The treaty concerning the basis of relations between the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic, signed in 1972, contained the following provisions. Good neighborly relations between the two states on an equal basis is saying a lot. Before that, we considered ourselves Germany and the other as the Soviet occupation zone. Non-use of force, inviolability of borders. None of the states can represent the other internationally. Their powers are limited to their own territory. And, importantly, they will conclude agreements on economic relations, science, postal connections, telecommunications, culture, and sports. These were areas that the GDR had an interest in, and they thought, okay, we can have some practical treaties on these matters. They will exchange permanent representatives. And that's very important. The GDR would have liked to call them ambassadors, and that would have meant international recognition. Permanent representatives was just 1 millimeter under international recognition. The treaties, after heated debate, were approved in the Bundestag. And you could say that the legal situation that was thus created was very strange, a sort of recognition, but not international recognition, legal, but not under international law. Egon Braun used the term of abnormal normalization. This was what we lived with, and we thought we would live with it for a very long time. The détente policy made possible the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The conference in Helsinki, on the one hand, underlined the inviolability of existing borders, but on the other hand, committed all participating states to the respect of human rights. Treaties between the Federal Republic of Germany and Poland allowed remaining Germans, German nationals and ethnic Germans, who so wished to move from Poland to West Germany, and Germans to visit Poland. Very important humanitarian consequences. An interesting aspect was trade between East and West Germany. And this is also an issue that exists between Georgia or in Georgia with regard to the Tornado regions. Do we trade with them, or is it better to isolate them as much as possible? West Germany opted for a policy of trade and even supported this trade with government credit. Ever so often the East was not in a position to pay what they ordered, so they received a credit from the West. Over time the credit portfolio was enlarged, and it created a situation of dependency that East German government didn't realize in the 1970s, but during the 1980s it became more and more pressing. Over the decades, the economy of the GDR and the living standards of people fell more and more back compared with the West. This could not be hidden thanks to Western visitors and Western television, which could be received in East Germany. There was no complete isolation. People could see what the living standard in the West was. From the early 1980s, in addition, acute economic problems accumulated in both the Soviet Union and the countries allied to it. This had to do with the fall in the oil prices. Already then, the Soviet Union was dependent on oil. The GDR was not able to service its debt to pay the interest payments to Western institutions. At some point, the federal government arranged a new credit from West German banks, a credit of 2 billion Deutschmarks, a very significant sum at the time. And the GDR was even ready to pay a certain political price. Normally it was very reluctant to link political issues to economic issues. But for the 2 billion, guess what they were ready to do? On the border inside Germany, there was not only barbed wire and landmines, but also self-detonating devices. If you approached this fence from the east, touched it, you touched a wire, maybe you came at night to try to jump or climb across the fence, you will set off a self-detonating device that will send a spray of bullets in your direction. And this was a very cruel weapon. Over time, between 200 and 300 people died on the border inside Germany and on the Berlin Wall. But for the 2 billion credit, the East German government was ready to dismantle not all of these self-detonating devices, but a certain number of them. And this was the nature of negotiations that East and West Germany led with each other. It is, you can imagine that this is a very strange moral situation. Okay, please take down 12% of your self-detonating devices so that not so many people are torn apart when they touch that fence. No, we'll give you only 8%. Yeah? There were very ambiguous situations, but slowly the substance of relations grew stronger. I don't know what would have happened over the longer term, or how long it would have taken for the wall to actually disappear, to fall, to be undermined. But developments in the GDR accelerated significantly in 1988 and 1989. We are coming to this famous year. A record number of people applied for permission to leave the GDR. There were so many people who wanted to leave, who were ready to say so, even though they knew that they would face very difficult conditions, repressions from the government. After you had announced your intention to leave the German Democratic Republic, most wonderful state on earth, the government was not your friend anymore. You didn't receive any permission, any consumer goods, your kids would have trouble in school, and so on. But still more and more people did that, said we want to leave. In 1988, the GDR government started to say, okay, there are a couple of people here who want to leave, it's better to let them go, otherwise they will foster discontent in the population. Let the bad ones go and the good ones, the ones who are happy, will stay. Of course, that was an illusion. The GDR signed an OCE convention, the Vienna Convention, that stipulated, that obliged states to let their citizens leave, to let them travel freely. But still people tried to cross the border inside Germany and to cross the Berlin Wall. In February 1989, one more man was shot by border guards in Berlin. This led to another outcry in Western public opinion. And the GDR actually took the step to renounce the shoot-to-kill order given to its border troops. They had clear orders, if somebody wants to cross the border, stop him, and if you cannot do otherwise, stop him with your weapon. Survival is not important. And still after the shoot-to-kill order was renounced, there was the last person who died in Berlin, a man who tried to travel to the west using a hot air balloon that he had built himself. He fell to his death in Charlottenburg in March of 1989, exactly 30 years ago. Also in March there were local elections in the GDR. Local elections were always falsified in the communist countries, as elections generally were. But at this point, in this situation in the GDR, there were election observers from civil society, a phenomenon that we still have today, that is important. And they were able to expose the massive fraud. They were talking to people, and people declared, I voted invalid. I handed in invalid an invalid ballot. If you had 100 people, you could already show that the claim of the government that at this voting station 99.8% have voted for the unified list of the communists and the other parties could not be correct. So discontent started rising in the GDR. Developments in the neighboring countries had a massive impact on the situation in the GDR. Developments in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. In May, the Hungarian government, which was also in need of Western credits, they had received credits that they could not service, they needed new credits, began to dismantle fences on its border to Austria. In Poland, the Round Table had begun its deliberations. The regime representatives had to sit down for the first time with opposition representatives, unheard of in the Soviet bloc. At this time, I was in Poland doing language training to join the diplomatic service. And this was when the negotiations took place. In the summer of 1989, more tourists from the GDR than usual stayed in Hungary. Why had so many people traveled to Hungary? Of course, it was always a nice country to travel, and the options inside the Eastern Bloc were not so numerous. But people had heard that the government had begun to dismantle the border fences to Austria. So they assembled in Hungary, camping, sleeping in cars sometimes, and there were more and more of them. In August, an organization called the Pan-European Union, conservative pro-European organization, organized something called a Pan-European picnic in Poland. So they just said, okay, on this day we do a big picnic which has to do with overcoming borders in Europe. We are the Pan-European movement. One of the leaders of this movement was Otto von Habsburg. Famous family, and he could have been king of Hungary actually. So maybe that made it possible for him to organize such a thing. Thousands of tourists from the GDR heard about this event, and they realized this is a way we have an excuse to travel to a place very close to the border. They are organizing something there. We will just go as visitors, and who knows? And indeed, they received a signal, and they realized that the Hungarian border guards would just look away on that day. There's terrific film footage of how the people in this crowd realized that it's actually happening, and they let their cars stand, and they just grab their babies and start to run towards the border fence to get across. In the Warsaw Embassy, where I was working by that time, we had more and more strange visitors. When I worked late, and I was very eager in my early days, I wanted to leave the office, you had to cross the hall of the embassy. And only the guard was still there. I asked the guard, who is that lying on the floor here? Oh, don't worry, don't look at them. It's just a family staying here for the night. Go on, leave. Yeah? Next day, same situation, but more people sleeping in our hallway. What's going on here? That's none of your business. Yeah? So we tried to keep that secret, but more and more East Germans came to our embassy in Warsaw. And of course they were German citizens to us. So the embassy had to take them in. But they had only East German passports. We could give them West German passports, but then they had no visa for Poland. And the Polish border guards, under rules of the Warsaw Pact, could not let anybody pass to another country or the airport on a flight to West Germany if you didn't have a visa. So people kept coming to the embassy and they had no idea what would become of them. There was no way out. Who could go to this embassy and stay there? Yes, but did they want to spend their lives sleeping on our corridors? August, beginning of September, more and more people started to come. In Prague, the situation was the same, also a country where many East German tourists traveled. In Prague, the embassy was better off. They had a garden, actually a small park. Yeah, small, really, not very big. And the Czech police was more stricter than the Polish police. They would try to keep people from entering the embassy and this garden. So they had to play cat and mouse with the police and wait for a moment when the police guards went away and then run towards the fence, climb over the fence, maybe throw a kid across, and be in the embassy garden. And imagine what it meant in 1989. These were still communist times for an embassy to feed 100 people, 200 people assembling in your little office building. It was an unusual situation. We received supplies, of course, and we had to work with less and less space. I remember a situation one morning when I opened the door to my office, and the day before I had left it, there was my desk, my books, and my telephone. I opened the door, and there were 2 stacks of beds and 2 happy families camping in my office saying, "Hello, yes, join us, come in." I said, "No, this is my office." "No, it's not anymore. Now we are here." We get more and more of these embassy refugees. Anyway, please excuse my anecdotes. In the GDR itself, things were also developing. There was a peace movement associated with the Protestant church, most of all. And in a church in Leipzig, peace prayers were held every Monday. This became a meeting place, a meeting venue for people who wanted to discuss freely, who wanted to express their wishes, dreams, and very often it was the dream to leave the GDR or to come to a completely different, a better GDR. Through Western television, footage of these events was spread in East Germany. The GDR television would of course ignore this, but Western television showed it. In order to resolve the situation in the embassies, the East German government made an offer, a very dramatic and a generous offer. They sent an envoy to the embassies in Budapest, Prague, and Warsaw, and talked to the people from the GDR who were camping in these embassies under difficult conditions with no perspective to leave. They said, "Okay, the government of the GDR generously grants you the permission to leave on condition that first you come back to the GDR, you get your papers in order, and after a maximum of 6 months you will be allowed to leave to West Germany, if you want that." I remember the meeting they had in a packed room in this embassy, and somebody asked a critical question. Does that also apply to me, that the police has something on me in the GDR? Can you guarantee me that I will be allowed to leave? And then this envoy said, "Okay, in your case, we will have to check that individually." And then somebody else in this crowd said, "Okay, then we can leave." And they all left the room and left this East German envoy standing there. He didn't manage to convince the people to take that solution. Foreign Minister Genscher negotiated with the foreign minister of the GDR. It was a good thing that they met at the United Nations in September of 1989, and they found a new solution. And I found out about this. There was no internet, of course. You had a news ticker in the embassy, a machine that would print out the news. And one day I saw how the ambassador came in, looked at the news ticker, and then took all the paper, shut off the machine, and took it away. So there was important news which the ambassador wanted to hide. And it was this agreement between the West German and East German foreign minister. In the following hours, we brought all the East Germans together in the embassy. By that time there were 800 of them. They were staying in hotels and campgrounds and so on. We brought them all to the embassy, and the same in Prague. They were assembled in this garden. In Prague, Genscher announced the news, and in our embassy it was his state secretary. We have made an arrangement. You will leave for West Germany tonight, right? Tonight. You cannot imagine the outburst of joy from people. They could really not believe it. From Prague, there is footage that you can see. You can find it on YouTube, I guess. Just try the night of Prague, and you will find this. And in Warsaw, we had no television footage. So again, we needed buses. We brought all these 800 people to the train station, and the train was waiting to take them through East Germany to West Germany. On the train, border guards of the GDR would issue papers to them, legalizing their exit. The GDR did not want a revolution, it did not want to be forced, it wanted to say, we have permitted them to leave East Germany. This was a fatal decision by the GDR. They could have just simply allowed the people to take the planes, travel from Poland to West Germany. It could have taken a week or so, organized that, no problem. But the trains traveling through East Germany in that situation in the fall of 1989, try to imagine people who wanted to leave anyway, and who thought they would never have a chance. Now saw a train passing through their country. They knew these trains were coming. It was on Western news, of course. Oh, these people can leave. So there were demonstrations in all the cities where the trains passed, at the train stations. We want to leave, we want to leave. And the GDR police couldn't take the situation under control anymore. This massively reinforced the opposition or the freedom movement in East Germany. So as a plan to relieve pressure, this failed spectacularly. And finally, on November 9th, Chancellor Kohl came to Warsaw to visit the new Polish government, the first non-communist government in the Eastern Bloc. It was a very great occasion for our embassy. We had prepared this for many weeks under difficult conditions. And well, I was leading a part of this delegation. We were in town all day, and you have to remember there were no mobile phones, no internet. You read the newspaper in the morning, and that was all the news you got. And television was not very good in communist Poland. So in the evening, after I had brought my delegation back to the hotel, I decided to go to the embassy once again. And I found about 30 people in a very small room, about this size, assembled around the one television set we had with a satellite receiver. Satellite receivers were something new at this time. I saw only their backs. People, colleagues, what's going on? What are you doing? And they were saying, oh, you have to watch. The Berlin Wall is coming down. And we actually saw the footage just like this for hours, people sitting on the Berlin Wall. And others, you may have seen this, had brought their little hammers. They sat on the wall, quietly pecking away at the concrete. What had happened? The East German party leadership had changed under all that pressure. And they had a new press spokesperson. And this press spokesperson had heard something about a new policy concerning conditions to leave the GDR. As I told you, it had already become more liberal than the month before. And now they were thinking of how really to relieve that pressure and how to get rid of the problem that you had to guard borders, but you couldn't shoot anymore, what to do with that. So he gave a news conference, and at the end of the news conference he said, oh yes, and we also have a new regulation concerning border crossing points. They will operate around the clock and they will treat matters pragmatically. I don't have the precise wording. somebody of the journalists asked, what are you saying? When will this come into effect? And the speaker looked at his paper and didn't find anything. And, okay, I guess, well, that's in effect already. That's valid from now. He later claimed that it was a trick he played himself. Okay, it's not important. But the effect was very clear. People throughout East Berlin, does this mean the Berlin Wall doesn't exist anymore? We can just go to a crossing point and leave and maybe go back and forth. We can come back to our own apartment later on. How is that possible? So just to find out, people assembled on the wall. And the pressure on these border guards grew so strong that people asked to leave. It's a decision of the new leadership, you have to let us through. The guards called for reinforcements, they called for orders, and nobody was able to give them any. There is the story of the Soviet embassy in East Berlin, where the young attaché saw this development and he went to his ambassador and said, Ambassador, this is revolutionary what's going on here, we have to tell Moscow right away. And the mood among the communist officials at this point was already, oh, the ship is sinking, it better happens without too much trouble for us, we don't want to. So he said, no, let's wait until tomorrow. We will give the news to Moscow tomorrow. We shouldn't wake up people at night. Huh? Okay, and by the morning, of course, the wall, you see the picture, people had crossed the crossing points and people were coming from the east and the west, and it was just impossible to stabilize the situation from an eastern point of view. I will quickly come to a conclusion. Also, on this day, November 9th, it was not clear at all that this would lead to reunification of Germany. Even in the weeks and months that followed, many people in the East believed that it could be possible to create a new GDR, a democratic GDR, and they were ambivalent about the West, which they didn't know, had only heard about in the news. And can you really trust the news? Can you trust Western television more than Eastern television? So it took a couple of months. The first free elections in East Germany took place on March 18th, 1989. We will have the anniversary really soon, and people voted for parties, new parties that had been created and that were advocating the reunification of Germany. A massive amount of negotiation was necessary, not only between the two German states, but remember, there was still the four-power status of Germany. Back in 1945, the four Allied powers had decided that they would take decisions on Germany at some later stage. And for all these decades, they had not been able to do it. So now they finally were. Negotiations took place in the so-called 2+4 format. Famously, importantly, Foreign Minister Shevardnadze representing the Soviet Union. And in August of 1989, the 2+4 treaty was signed, which created an international framework for the reunification of Germany. Very importantly, it covered the issue of the eastern areas of Germany that were under Polish and Russian, Soviet administration, not only occupation but administration. And the new united Germany was obliged, even before it came into existence, to conclude border treaties with Poland and the Soviet Union and to renounce these territories for good, which it also did in the following months. In Germany, the route of Article 23 was chosen. Länder governments were recreated. At that point, the Länder in the GDR did not exist anymore, but they were re-established. And they voted to join the Federal Republic of Germany. Article 146 would have made it possible to create a completely new constitution, to start a new state. And some people were dreaming of some sort of synthesis between East and West, which could be created on this basis. But actually, when people thought about it, they preferred to have the legal order that had already been established in 40 plus years of Western Germany, with a lot of legislation and juridical decisions. And this became the framework for unification. I want to stop here, and I don't want to draw fundamental conclusions, especially not for the Georgian situation. Maybe we can do that when you have questions or discussion. But one thing is important to me about this history. Even if you think that something is there to stay, it is unchangeable, there is no political path that leads to change, you have to be aware that history is working in the background, and nothing is ever guaranteed. I think we were very lucky as Germans that this year 1989 came so soon, just 40 years after the creation of the two German states. It could have taken longer, but in the end I think there was no other outcome thinkable. And the Berlin Wall, which you still see on that picture, just by the perversity of it, it's always a visible sign that here a political force tried to do something unnatural, to divide a city in two and to keep the people of one side from communicating with the other side. And our then president, von Weizsäcker, had the quote, "As long as the Berlin Wall exists, as long as the Brandenburg Gate is closed, the German question is open." This is how he put it to Gorbachev during the visit. If you really want to maintain this situation, concrete and barbed wire and self-detonating devices, if that is what you have to rely on, then your political project is not viable and will not stand. All right, thank you very much. I look forward to You were extremely patient. Thank you very much.
Since time, now we have the European Union, and my question about it is about the current situation concerning the possibility of a European army. Chancellor Merkel spoke about this last year. I think French President also. Can you share your opinion about this? And is this still discussed in Europe, in Germany in particular, the possibility of European army that will probably intervene in case there are some threats, future threats to the European Union or other member states and so on? Thank you.
Okay. Well, the European army on one side is a very long-term vision. It's still far away. The main reason is not that the armies are not able to organize it, but that each country has its own decision-making to decide on how to use the army. In our case, in Germany, it's always Parliament which has to make the decision. In France, the president as commander-in-chief can decide a lot already. So how could we employ an army that is European? Difficult question, which stands in the way. On the other hand, immediately after the unification of Germany, European integration received a new impulse. And the thinking was in all of Europe that before the challenges of this time, the European Union had to become stronger. It was decided to create the currency union and also the common foreign and security policy. This has developed over time. Maybe the development is not dramatic and you don't see anything sensational even after a long time. But look at the missions that the the European Union carries out in the Balkans, in the Indian Ocean, in the Mediterranean region and Africa. So there is a certain capacity to act in crisis situations. This did not exist in the 1990s when we had the wars in former Yugoslavia, and that also was a reason to create these mechanisms. I would call it not a European army that we have today, but a solid mechanism of cooperation. And if we muster the political will, we have the possibilities to act.
Thank you very much.
It's up.
Okay, thank you very much for your combination of the history of either Germany and the insight in your diplomatic work. So to show, I know a lot of the students of international relations are here, how important it is to have the right wording at hand. That is really gives you the space to maneuver. You not directly hinted also to the Eastern policy by Brandt, but there was a picture of him being, and also the attempts through the Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe to improve the situation of the individuals, what is today called human security. I now read in the newspapers that Heiko Maas, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, committed himself to elaborate a new Eastern policy. I will not know to ask you to be a fortune teller, but what might be then the experience of Germany that might inspire a new Eastern policy in also the European framework?
Oh, very deep questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Reisler. Yes, to have the right words at hand, to have very subtle language, sometimes to bend language a little bit if it is necessary. These are, of course, tools of diplomacy. The essential lesson, and I think the diplomatic situations of the early 1970s were very difficult. It is hard to imagine anything more difficult when you have fundamentally different points of view and you have to agree on a text that covers them. Take the four-power agreement of Berlin. On Berlin, the two sides could not even agree on how to call what they were talking about. For some it was Berlin, for the others it was West Berlin. So they wrote an agreement that constantly talked about the area in question. But it was enough to understand what was meant, and sometimes history can develop on the basis of very, very flimsy, very subtle diplomatic constructions. I think the experience of this Ostpolitik of the 1970s has shaped German foreign policy, has influenced it forever. We were raised as young diplomats with these lessons in mind, and now, 30 years later, the younger ones are still trained with these lessons. We generally have the approach that you should look at every difficult situation with a view of how to stabilize it, of how possibly to overcome it, of how to find sometimes formula compromises. You can see this very clearly in the 2015 Minsk agreement, dealing with the situation in eastern Ukraine. It did not work so far, I admit, although we worked hard. I was part of it when we were in Moscow. But the method of working was very similar to the treaties of the early 1970s. You have one side that looks at reality from a completely different point of view. You have the other side which has its full rights as the legal state, as sovereignty, which is covered by the inviolability of borders. The old principles of Helsinki are very applicable to the Ukrainian situation. And still you want to come to an agreement. You can look at the Minsk agreement, it's a very similar construction. It does not always work. Sometimes the only effect is to stop a hot crisis, bloody war that is going on from spiraling further out of control. But the hope is that a situation which is not natural, which is artificial, which has to be maintained by military force, will prove untenable in the end. And if you look at the principles of the Helsinki Charter, 1975, the Soviet Union could agree, the United States could agree, East and West Germany signed this charter. The same principles continue to make the consensus today. And only Russia chooses to interpret them in a way that is visibly perverse, saying, yes, we are fully for the inviolability of borders. This principle is sacred to us. Yes, but of course this applies to our border that includes Crimea. Okay, it is clear that this is a very artificial application of Helsinki criteria. I think that in the long term, and today I want to be more courageous than as a school student in Berlin, I think that the Helsinki principles will prevail because they are the consensus in Europe, including in countries like Belarus, Kazakhstan, and the OSCE area includes even Uzbekistan and Tajikistan.
Approximately 3 weeks ago, General Ben Hodges said that NATO has to invite Georgia in the alliance next summit. And he said that there was a precedent that East Germany was under the occupation of the Soviet Union. And I remember also a speech of Estonian president when she said that Georgian politicians are being told that due to the occupation, the country is full, Georgia cannot be a member of NATO. So I'm interested in is the occupation a reason?
Is it occupation or isn't it occupation?
Is the occupation reason?
But, well, with General Hodges, you had a slightly different issue. You know that Chancellor Merkel was here last August, and she had a very good discussion with students at a neighboring institution, should I put it this way? And the students pressed her very hard on the terminology, is this occupation? So you can look at it in very simple terms and say, here are foreign troops on the territory of a state without the consent of the state, so it's occupation. And she gave this to the students. Okay, we can call it occupation. What is important in the situation here in Georgia, I think, is not to try to put this entire conflict into just one word. Okay, the problem is the occupation of Georgia by Russia. The Georgian-Russian conflict is there, and it's an important component, important level of the overall conflict. But you also have conflicts inside Georgia that existed before the occupation, that existed for many years. You have the experience of the wars of the early 1990s, where ethnic interests were pitted against each other, maybe artificially, maybe through political influence, but there was a consciousness that the Abkhaz identity could not coexist with the Georgian identity in the country as it was constructed. So these conflicts have to be addressed. And of course there's also a third layer, which is not between Georgia and Russia, but between Russia and the West. It because I worked at the Moscow embassy for 4 years, and the Russians often made it clear to us that they thought they were in a sort of football game, not with countries like Georgia or even Ukraine, but they wanted to score a goal against the West. The West has won so much, they said, starting with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we have lost. This is a feeling that I think the Russian government intentionally creates in the population. We have lost over the years. We have been pressed back by the West. NATO has expanded. So finally, we want to score a goal to the other side. We don't want to be 10-0. We want to score a goal as well. Let's take Crimea. Let's have South Ossetia and Abkhazia, our troops south of the Caucasus. Let's see how easy it will be to enter Georgia into NATO under these conditions. We have to consider all the levels of the conflict, east-west, Russia, Georgia, and inside Georgia. And now I forgot the first part of the question, which was interesting. Oh, Hodges, yes. I would like to discuss this with General Hodges, of course. You know, I'm not 100% sure what he said and what he really meant. But the way you just put it, it sounded like the situation of Germany was wonderful back then, because West Germany was a part of NATO. Great. Yes, we were part of NATO, but NATO covered only part of our country. And the dividing line between two huge military blocs ran in our country. It was not a comfortable situation at all. We were under the feeling that we were a frontline state, that we were constantly under threat. Every year there were military exercises, huge numbers, nothing like you see today. The fact that West Germany was part of NATO was seen as something that contributed to the division of Germany. We couldn't imagine that the antagonism between the two blocs would come to an end. So belonging to the bloc gave us security, but a very relative security. I don't think it's a situation that Georgia should aspire to. And the division of Germany, so much is clear, Germany was divided as a result of World War II, the war that we had started, that had been so devastating for all of Europe. It was massive guilt, and that led to a situation where the four powers had a right, having defeated Germany, had a right to occupy Germany, and they could have occupied it indefinitely. I would not apply that in any way to Georgia, to the Georgian situation. Please.
First of all, thank you for your very nice presentation. And I wanted to ask about the challenges of the unification. You have told the story how East and West Germany got unified. But even today, inside the Germany, there is this feeling that there are East Germans and that there are West Germans, and that certain sentiments and certain things that are more amplified in East Germany, they are not the same as in the West Germany, especially now with the new right-wing movements, right extreme getting more power. It's more to feel in the former East German parts than in the Western parts. And what do you think? What are the challenges of the unification, even after 30 years of being one country?
Thank you. That's a very good question. The question that could require another lecture of similar extent. What can I say quickly? On the economic level, there are figures, and it's easy to say. Even after reunification, people continued to leave East Germany and go to West Germany. The economic opportunities were simply better jobs, the industry in the East first collapsed and had to rebuild and was not rebuilt to the same extent. So economically we have a difference. I think by now the figures are that the GDP per capita in the former Eastern Germany is only 80% that of the West. And it is approaching only very slowly. There's not much convergence anymore. There was in the first years or the late 1990s, let's say, but now it's not converging so much. You also have to see, of course, that regions are structurally different in every country. In Georgia, Kakheti is not like Imereti, for instance, and Brandenburg was never a rich region. It was always considered the sandbox of Germany, as they called it, very sandy area, not good for agriculture. So that's the economic level, but the flux of people has more or less stabilized. And today, young Germans from the western regions also like to pick a university in the eastern regions, for instance, because there's a better ratio of teaching staff to students. The conditions for studying there are actually quite good. I would recommend that personally. You spoke about the sentiments of people, how do they look at each other. I want to give you a personal answer as much as I can. You know that the federal government moved from Bonn to Berlin in 1999. This time I was working in Bonn for the government, so we moved to Berlin directly, and we were curious and we moved to the east. And it was really a bit like moving to a foreign country. This was 9 years after unification. We were looked at as strangers, not people greeted us nicely, but they found it curious. Why do you come here? What's going on? Huh? They emphasized a bit of their own lifestyle, which would, for instance, involve to give children to kindergarten very early on, after 1 year, or even at the age of a year, or even a couple of months. Whereas in West Germany, the rule was that the kid got to kindergarten with 3 years, maybe 2.5. Many such things. And I always remember how they used to say, well, you have to understand, this all used to be the East around here. War doch alles Osten hier, wa? In the Berlin dialect. We were posted to Poland, we had other assignments. We came back in 2008. Our daughter entered school, and I asked, my wife was more involved with the school and knew people better, and I asked her, well, what kids are there in this class? Are they all from the East? Are some from the West? And we realized we knew the kids, we knew the parents, but we couldn't tell. And I think the couple of years have made a big difference in that respect. Of course, later on we knew the life stories of people, and I wouldn't say there's no difference anymore, but for the generation of our daughter, who's 18 now, it is not a significant fact. You can realize that somebody comes from an Eastern German family. And you have to look at the passage of time. The division of Germany, which we thought was eternal, lasted for 40 years. And now we have 30 years since 1989. So a lot of time has really passed.
Hello again, I'm Levan. I'm a student of Free State University. And first of all, I would like to thank you for your interesting presentation, for your come here and introduce me information about the time in Germany. And also, I'm a student of ecology, and I know how Germany helps Georgia and also the forest science. My question is about what's your idea? Do Georgia, integration of Georgia right now can be better or even better with our territory?
Integration into the EU or
NATO.
into NATO?
Because the influence of the time is NATO support West Germany a lot. And also they have the defense from the NATO. But also the media help to spread the information to the East Germany. And this was the reason why the people from Eastern Germany, they are willing to join the West to break down this Berlin Wall. And in this case, in Georgia, we don't have such kind of situation. We are not a member of NATO. We don't have this kind of support, and we don't have that much to show the people from the occupied territories that they
yes, well, NATO gave a lot of support to West Germany, true. Without NATO, Western Germany couldn't have been a safe country. We don't have a feeling of insecurity, true. We also think that we made a great contribution to NATO because we were the central part of NATO geographically. And all these installations on our territory, the Bundeswehr was German armed forces, West German armed forces were numerous at this time, well financed, and were an important part of the land defenses of NATO. This is a bit different from the geostrategic position of Georgia. Television and all that had less to do with NATO. Here I think that the economic success of West Germany, which was really remarkable in the first decades after World War II, starting about 1948, the currency reform. This was very strong, and it had a lot to do with European integration. Without the common market, the European Union that later developed, I don't think we would have developed the same economy, the same standard of living that just left the East behind. When we visited Eastern Germany in the 1980s, it was very visible how these people are living under terrible conditions. We want to visit, but we're very happy to leave after a short time. So this had less to do with NATO. I do think that Georgia, and just recently I talked to some NGO representatives who traveled between Tbilisi and Abkhazia. They are saying that people in Abkhazia have a strong feeling of being isolated. They realize that the only place to go is Russia. And yes, then we can go to the rest of the world, but we have to leave your home far behind. Feeling of isolation is there. Maybe there's not a strong feeling of political opposition, but this was not the case in the GDR even in the mid-1980s, even 3 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Didn't have the feeling that these people want to change. In Poland, yes. In East Germany, it was not the case. If Georgia fulfills its project, building a democracy here, a market economy, approximating to the European living standard, I think you're preparing that here at an educational institution, at the university. You're working for an economy that will be there in the future. I think Georgia has every chance to be very attractive to people living in these regions. The question is what the political dynamic could be in the regions, how it could work. question is how they look at Georgia today. This I don't know very well. Some NGOs are working there, but are people afraid of Georgians? Even the East Germans looked at us West Germans with slight ambivalence. And, you know, I have this one memory of a visit to East Germany. It was organized by the church. We had a partner congregation, so we packed our car, and it was. And one day we could easily drive to the Potsdam area where our partners were. And of course, we had our trunk, our car full of goodies from our supermarket. Nothing expensive, nothing special, just what you would bring shopping, coffee, yes, some bananas and some fruits from southern countries and so on. And we gave them to our hosts where we stayed overnight. We will stay at your place, so thank you very much. Here's a box of coffee. No, you make us rich. This is impossible. How could you spend so much money on this? This is, and we noticed that it was to a degree humiliating to them. Of course, they wanted it, but and rice. There's rice. Yeah. It's not so easy to bring people together with that experience, and you alluded to the fact that still after unification the feelings were quite strong. So difficult for us to imagine what the feelings in Abkhazia or Southeast Asia could be today. By the way, I noticed that I forgot my last slide, my last photograph, this one. So that's the condition for reunification. Ladies, if you are ready to kiss any Abkhaz on the night of reunification, then the conditions are right. It should be vice versa on the other side.
It's the vice versa.
Yes.